Our story starts with a guy accusing the main character of poisoning a woman named Maria. His first reaction is to draw his sword. Our girl's name was Bianca. She had deep blue eyes and striking blonde hair. She confirms his suspicions, saying she got rid of the girl and knew that now everything would go back to the way it was supposed to be. But his expression goes absolutely terrified at her answer. Even so, Bianca keeps telling Ricardo to get his head straight because she was the woman who was supposed to be with him. He just couldn't see it because he'd fallen for that second-rate girl. Being close to his ear, she whispers, asking him to let her save him. But his first reaction is to draw his sword and say no, because actually he was the one who was going to do that for her. His words excite our main character, who hadn't understood the trap she was walking into. In fact, she believed that her man had finally come back to his senses. She just didn't expect to be brutally struck. Right in her throat, she tried to scream, asking what he had done, while Ricardo's blade dripped with her blood. She coughed desperately, while the cold young man explained that he would kill her so she would never commit another sin. Without the slightest pity, watching that girl on her knees in front of him, then he declares that, as her former fiancé /U00E9, he was offering her salvation. That's what was written on the pages of that cursed book, which predicted the main character's future. Bianca throws the book across the room. She couldn't believe any of this was real. And her scream was so loud that one of the maids rushed in, worried, with no idea what was happening. But she was quickly shooed away by Bianca, who had zero patience to deal with anyone at that moment. She was grinding her teeth from sheer nerves, wondering what kind of book this even was. She had bought it thinking it was just a regular history book, and the only reason that particular work had caught her attention was that the main character shared the same name as her fiancé /U00E9, Ricardo. But then our girl got hooked, because her own name showed up in it too. The only daughter of the Splendor Empire, of the Marquis and Marcy ones of Crawford, Bianca Crawford, she even thought she was going to be the female lead. But what happened was very different. In that story, Bianca was the villain, and she ended up being beheaded. Sometime later, outside the palace, surrounded by a beautiful garden and plenty of food, the girl asks her fiancé /U00E9 if the day isn't lovely for him too. Ricardo Weinkaiser agrees. Without much enthusiasm, he was gorgeous, he had a face that matched his broad shoulders and long legs perfectly, and he wasn't just the heir to that duchy, he was also a highly respected knight. So it wasn't an exaggeration to say he was the perfect man, and Bianca watched him carefully while she sipped her tea, thinking about how she also loved his deep voice, along with everything else. But the big problem was that he was the main character in that cursed book. Of course it made total sense that a man like that would be the lead. Of course Bianca wasn't far behind. Even though her family wasn't exactly on the same level as the Weinkaiser Duchy, she still came from a very prestigious lineage. Not to mention she was recognized as one of the most beautiful women in the empire. But even so, Bianca wasn't the lead in the book. No, the lead was Maria, and that wouldn't leave our girl's head. She was on the other end of the rope compared to Bianca. She was Ricardo's love interest and came from a poor background, living in the rural areas of the kingdom. The main character could admit that the redhead was somewhat pretty, but she had absolutely no sense of culture or sophistication. So Bianca wasn't going to give in, especially not for a woman she hadn't even seen or heard of yet in real life. Back to Ricardo, our girl knew he had never treated her with much warmth, but he also didn't look at her with contempt or showed that he hated her. He was just a calm person, like a perfectly still lake. The thing is, the book portrayed him as a passionate man. He smiled and twirled with Maria on those pages, something he had never shown Bianca during their time together. And she had to sit through scenes of the two of them having an intense love life in that wretched book. Knowing who she was, she read it over and over to analyze every detail. Any other noble woman in her position would have fainted from how steamy the descriptions were. She didn't even notice she had lost herself in thought until her fiancé /U00E9 asked if she was okay because she looked awkward. And the girl tries to play it off, saying it was nothing. But she quickly gave in to curiosity and said she had a question. She wanted to know under what circumstances her future husband would kill someone. He answers without thinking twice, probably during a war. Of course, he was a veteran knight who had already fought in 2 wars. But Bianca pushes, wanting to know what other scenario would make him do it. That was a strange question. And the guy asked why she wanted to know something like that. She couldn't explain that it was because in the book he had killed her outside of a war. As she flipped through the pages, Bianca couldn't accept the fact that Ricardo had abandoned her, and that only proved how big her love was. Because of her jealousy, Bianca had directed all her anger at Maria and ultimately took her life. She would do anything just to win back her fiancé U00E9's love. Realizing that the conversation wasn't going anywhere and that she was just getting more tangled up, she asked him to forget it. But that's exactly when Ricardo decided to speak up and reveal that he would only kill someone if that person hurt someone he cared deeply about. His words are enough to bring back the terrible image of him murdering her in the book. She swallows hard, not knowing what to say, while her fiancé U00E9 stands up from the table, commenting that she was acting very strangely that day. She had been flushed earlier, but now she looked as white as a ghost. That makes her eyes go wide. Was he actually worried about her? The same Ricardo who was so cold and distant every day? Could it be that he was finally going to start acting with the burning passion shown in the book? Of course that didn't happen. In fact, a guy just walked past her, leaving her there and said she should lie down and rest a bit. Deep down, our girl knew that would never happen in real life. That engagement was a simple arrangement between their families. Nothing more, nothing less. So, worn out, Bianca agrees she should rest and wishes him a good trip. Later, she went to her city's bookstore looking for answers, but had to hear from the owner that they didn't sell the book she despised so much. The main character was even outraged. She had no idea what that old man was talking about. She had bought the book there 3 days ago. He had even sold it to her himself. But the man denies it again, explaining he had never seen that book before. It didn't even have the bookstore's stamp on the cover, and he shakes one of the books they sold there right in front of her face. He explains that when he bought a book from there, they marked it by removing a label, so no one could trick them by claiming they bought those books somewhere else. On top of that, he adds that he had been selling books for 40 years and had never seen a title like that on any cover. Military books usually had the name of their publishing house in the title, and romance novels didn't sell unless they had catchy titles like How a Slave Brought a Modest Woman to Tears. That title actually caught our girl's attention quite a bit. It was an intriguing idea to think of a romance with a slave and a noblewoman, but she had to focus. So she went back to the subject, asking if there was really no way he had sold that to her. And again, the man says no. Threatening, the main character makes it clear that if this was a lie, she would make him pay with his life. But he explains he would never do something like that. Since she could see the argument was going nowhere, she decides to make a suggestion. He should come up with a new label system. After all, someone could just steal one of the books, remove the label, and insist they bought it there. Something the man knew was true. So the main character suggested that instead of removing part of the label, it would be better to put a marking on it, something that couldn't be copied by thieves. And it seemed like a great idea. She finally turns away, leaving the man grateful, even though the situation with the book hadn't been resolved. When she got home, the woman put that cursed book on the shelf carefully. She was exhausted. She had spent the last few days completely fixated on that book non-stop. But she didn't even have time to think about that, because she heard knocking at her door. It was the maid, carrying some clothes, explaining that Mr. Wensbury was getting ready for the charity dinner they were hosting that day. So she had come to help her get dressed. The maid was combing her hair while Bianca gets lost in her own thoughts. She just needed to forget about that book and live her life. It's not like the story was even that good anyway. She knew there was no way a knight like Mr. Wensbury could have a child outside of marriage. And why would Ricardo leave her just to fall for a bastard girl? That made no sense at all. All she had to do was look at herself. She was perfect. Any man's dream. Our girl was almost done getting ready. When her maid brought a pair of shoes saying it was time to put them on, they were white shoes with little flowers on the toe. But Bianca coldly asked if the girl was really sure those shoes matched her dress, leaving the maid flustered. Then the main character started, "This red dress goes with these corsage shoes?" The poor girl didn't know what to do. She had made a mistake without even realizing it. But she could tell that Bianca seemed furious just at the suggestion. While the main character wondered if that kid had the slightest sense of what beauty even was, still there must have been some reason she recommended those shoes to go with such a sophisticated dress. Nervously, the two maids started apologizing, saying they didn't mean to cause her any trouble or anything, which surprised the girl a little because to her it was just a simple question. So she sighs and tells them to drop it and bring a pair of black shoes. She knew her maids were afraid of her. She wasn't oblivious, and she hadn't made much effort to get close to them either. Because it was easier for the main character to have employees who were always on their toes than good friends, finally they headed downstairs for dinner. And Mr. Wensbury was commenting, while drinking, about how he once defeated 33 men on the battlefield all by himself, with no help from anyone. It was incredibly boring, and our girl couldn't believe she spent 3 hours getting ready for this nonsense of a gathering. But since she had to keep up appearances, she laughed and said Wednesbury's stories were always very interesting, which made the nobleman laugh even more, saying that was going to go straight to his head, since it wasn't every day he got compliments from a young lady as beautiful as her. In a way, she found it interesting that he had defeated more and more enemies of the Empire. She wanted to know how many more he could take out in his next battle. But the man laughs, saying his glory days were behind him, and comments that the new star of the Empire was Lord Wankeezer, who says that's very kind of him. Apparently Wednesbury was very jolly because he burst out laughing again, telling the boy not to be so modest. He even remembered him when he was younger. Completely changing the subject, he asked when the two of them were planning to get married, to which Ricardo responds eventually, but Bianca was impatient. First they had to wait for her debutante ball to pass, then they had to wait for him to come back from the war, then she waited for her 20th birthday, hoping he would propose. The problem was that 3 months had already passed since then, and Ricardo hadn't made the slightest move toward anything related to their engagement. Even so, there he was, insisting that their families had made a promise, and the two of them had to honor it. It wasn't romantic at all, the girl knew that. She knew that marriages between noble families were more like symbols of mutual trust and alliance than the result of true deep love. The problem was that her feelings for Ricardo were real, and almost deep. Thinking about this, on the way home, she asked if the two of them could talk, explaining it was about the topic they'd touched on at dinner, their marriage. As always, the guy seemed completely uninterested in anything she was going to say. Even so, the main character goes ahead, explaining that since she'd need to prepare a lot of things, it would be good if he gave her an estimate of when he was going to ask her. But the guy responds with a snarky comment, leaving her frozen with embarrassment when he asks if they were actually going to get married. But the answer isn't satisfying at all, because the guy just says probably. She couldn't believe he was actually saying that. That's when she remembered what she had read in the book and said the exact same thing. "You said you were going to marry me." Ricardo kept the same blank expression when he said that all he'd said was that, since their families made a promise, they would do their best to honor it. But for her, that meant they were definitely going to get married eventually. Then came the bomb. They weren't going to get married. Not anymore. In fact, the two of them were going to break off the engagement. Bianca was going crazy. She had read that in the book just recently, but there was no way that nightmare was actually going to come true. That's when she decided to use something she'd read to her advantage. She asked if he remembered a dog he raised when he was a little kid, and just the fact that she knew about it left him intrigued. He asks who told the main character that, but that didn't matter right now. In the book, when Ricardo saw Maria look at him with unconditional trust, he was reminded of that dog, which was the first living creature the boy had been able to truly trust and love. Now she was echoing that scene, commenting that if the two of them were going to live together, it would be nice if they could adopt a dog of the same breed, just like Maria had originally suggested in the book. And exactly like in the book, Ricardo responded that he refused to do something like that because no other dog could ever replace his, adding that she shouldn't try to replace anyone. The woman rushed into her room in a panic, absolutely furious, and grabbed the book from the shelf quickly, flipping through the pages while cursing that work she held in her hands. Could this thing actually be a prophecy? How could she be the villain? That was impossible. There was no way. She felt ridiculous, so she decided to put an end to it once and for all. She was going to rip the whole book apart, page by page if needed. The problem was that no matter how hard she pulled, nothing happened. Which wouldn't be a problem, because if that was the case, she could just burn it, so she threw the book into the fireplace in her room. A minute passed, then 5, and then 10. Something was very wrong with that book. It wouldn't burn at all. It was completely intact. So she pulled it out of the fireplace, cursing at it on the floor. It almost looked like it had come out cleaner than when it went in. If that book was right, Maria and Ricardo would meet on St. George's Day. Then they'd fall madly in love with each other, and she would just be another obstacle in the middle of that romance. But our girl didn't want to die. She couldn't die. She was a person with beauty, fortune, and a very high social status. So why did she have to be the one at a disadvantage here? She had to find a way out of this mess. Sometime later, she heard knocking at her door while reading that wretched book. It was the maids, there to help her get ready for the day. In the book, Bianca was a selfish little girl, who was certain Ricardo was madly in love with her. She was an extravagant woman who believed she was the most beautiful woman in the world. A villain who verbally abused people, mistreated anyone below her on the social ladder, and insisted she was always right. She had to find a way to change her image. So when the maid asked what she'd like to wear, she just said it didn't matter. And for her hair, just a simple comb-through, nothing fancy needed. While being dressed, she wondered how a nice girl like her could be treated like a villain. And besides, it wasn't her fault she was the most beautiful person there, right? The main character chose her sapphire jewelry set for that day, while questioning what was wrong with spending her own money on things she liked. It was strange, there was no reason for the book to distort obvious facts. Finally, a question broke her trance. What shoes would she like to wear that day? Shoes. She referred directly to the maid from the previous day, pointing to the white heels and asking if she hadn't liked them yesterday. The poor girl panicked immediately, apologizing over and over, saying her mom had just died and her brother was hurt, and she couldn't get fired because otherwise everyone would starve. But Bianca hadn't even asked any of that. The maid was crying, explaining how her family of 7 people would die of hunger if she got fired, when she finally heard her mistress's voice saying she'd like to wear that pair that day. After putting them on, Bianca asked what the girl's name was and she introduced herself as Panya. Panya Risoldi. Friendly, Bianca comments that since she helped her pick a great pair of shoes, she could ask the butler to give her a silver coin, which left the girl extremely grateful for the kindness. Speaking of the butler, the woman orders the girls to ask him to come to her room, and she stares at that book that couldn't be destroyed, even though she really wanted that. The butler finally enters the room and asks if she had called for him, which she promptly confirms, explaining that she needed him to look into someone's background. Her name was Maria Valona, a common girl from a city called Encina. He didn't know the reason for the sudden interest in a commoner, but simply asked what his mistress wanted him to find out. First, Bianca explained she needed to know if the woman actually existed, then she'd like to know her age, what she looked like, whether her mother was really sick, and whether she was planning to move to the capital. She wanted to find out everything she could, but above all, she needed to know what her connection was to Mr. Wensbury. In the book, she was introduced as his daughter, so she had to find out if that was true or not. After writing everything down, the butler asks if he could be of any more help, and the girl remembers a topic that didn't quite connect to what they were discussing, asking if he had ever heard anything about her reputation, to which he responds that her reputation was simply wonderful. She wasn't just known for being a beautiful woman, she had an elegance and wisdom that perfectly matched that beauty. She was the flower of the Splendor Empire in high society, but the main character cuts him off, explaining that wasn't what she was talking about. She wanted to know about her personality, what her servants actually thought of her behind her back. That was going to be a bit more complicated. The man had to pull a bit of a Pinocchio, and answered that everyone loved the girl, knowing full well that was nothing but a good lie, but the main character preferred not to push it, so she just dismissed the man. But before he left, she remembered Panya, asking him to give her a silver coin, which makes the man comment that the maid must have done something very right to deserve that, and Bianca explains that's pretty much it. She could almost hear the maid's voice echoing in her head, saying not to fire her because her mom had died, her dad had a hurt leg, she was the only one in the family who could work, and her 5 younger siblings were starving. Remembering that last part, our girl asks that some leftover bread be sent for her to take home, and so the butler says goodbye, leaving the girl alone with her thoughts and a lot of stress. She knew her personality wasn't exactly lovable, but what could she do? Was she really going to become the cruel villain like in the book? Suddenly, something caught her attention, an intense glow. The book was shining, glowing, like a clear sign of magic, and this makes our girl jump and curse every word she knew from the shock. She stayed huddled in the corner of the room until the glow slowly faded, and she returned to her senses to see what had actually happened, so she picks up the book with trembling hands, afraid it was going to explode. But it opened on its own, flipping through the pages quickly, and showing her something she didn't know was possible. The story had changed. Originally, the book ended with a scene of Ricardo and Maria sharing a passionate kiss after Bianca's death, but now it only showed what happened after the ending. The last page said that not even grass grew near the villain's grave. But while everyone in society avoided that place, thinking it was cursed, one maid, someone Bianca had shown kindness to, left a flower on top of her tombstone. The main character couldn't believe that had actually happened. She knew that the woman now mentioned there was probably Pa/U00F1A. She had never been very kind to any maid before. They were her servants, so she figured she just needed to pay them for their work. At least she thought their relationship was limited to that. But now with that change, she wondered if she had been wrong. Her heart was racing when she realized the story had actually changed. Just because she did something she had never done before, that's when she understood what she needed to do. She rings her bell to call Pa/U00F1A, who asks what Bianca wants, and she responds she needs the carriage prepared. When asked where she's going, the main character answered that she had to go to a nearby orphanage, leaving the poor girl even more confused. But there was no time to explain. It was time for Bianca to do her good deeds, so she asked her to also bring her checkbook and as much cash as possible. After all, no villain ever did good deeds. The trip wasn't very long, and they finally arrived. When she stepped out of the carriage, Bianca noticed the place was much better than she expected, while the maid worried asked if she was sure about what she was doing, which left our girl a bit confused. But the girl explained she thought her mistress hated going to those dirty, poor places like that. Even though the building didn't look that dirty in the main character's eyes, suddenly the two of them were called by a third person who wanted to know who they were, two kids asking if they were looking for someone specific. The younger one was hiding behind the older one's clothes, a little scared. But Pa/U00F1A approaches the two of them carefully and explains that this was Lady Bianca Crawford, and she wanted to speak with the director of the orphanage. So the older one runs inside screaming for the director, but our girl asks if they shouldn't just go in, since the director was right inside. But the maid says the least the director could do was come out and greet her. She glances at something from the corner of her eye, realizing that the smaller girl had been staring at her the whole time. Carefully, the little one excuses herself, getting the woman's attention, and asks if she was a princess, eyes sparkling. Again, the maid introduces her boss as Lady Bianca Crawford, but the little one insists that the main character was very pretty, so she wanted to know if she was sure she wasn't a princess. If you thought about it, her position in the empire was kind of like that of a princess, so she answered that she was almost one, which got the little girl very excited. Her girl just didn't know why she had said that, which would now give the girl another idea, who grabs her hand quickly, telling the woman they needed to go inside. Which makes the maid a little nervous. Who did that little girl think she was, grabbing her mistress like that with those dirty hands? Bianca had also noticed the dirt on the girl's hands, but for some reason, she didn't mind it one bit. Finally, inside the director's office, the woman asks what had brought such a fine, noble woman all the way there, to which she responds that she had come to sponsor the orphanage. Something that completely shocks Lena, who only now noticed Lala's presence there. Of course, that would be a huge help, but the news had come so suddenly that she barely knew what to say. However, Bianca explained she wanted something in return. She needed her to spread the word about the fact that she was sponsoring the orphanage. Her request was a bit unusual, and left the woman a little confused. Out of patience for having to explain herself, the main character says she should just tell people she was giving money to the orphanage. It didn't matter if she did it through the kids or put up some posters around the place. Lala was admiring her like she had walked right out of a fairy tale in the middle of all this. All she needed to do was improve her public image. She needed to show everyone she was a good person, and not just some book villain. And becoming a sponsor for a charity institution was the best way to do that. Even if the request seemed extremely selfish, Lena made it clear she would do it. With everything settled, it was time for the woman to write and sign the check. After the formalities were done, she stood up to leave, watching Lena thank her with tears in her eyes for the charity. That was more than enough to cover the renovations they needed to make, and even buy new clothes for the kids. She had no idea how to repay this kindness, but to Bianca, this was nothing. It was basically the price of 3 random dresses. But the woman felt very lucky, and made it clear she didn't need to worry, because she would spread the word about her good deeds. That's when she noticed something had shifted in the air. The main character had frozen, because she had run into someone she definitely hadn't expected to see there. Ricardo, who was looking at her with deep confusion, asking what she was doing in that place. All the girl managed to say was Ricardo's name out loud, but he just repeated the question, "What are you doing here? You have no reason to be here." His contempt makes her heart race immediately. Seriously, what did he think of her? Why was he so angry that the two of them had crossed paths? What did he think she was going to do to an orphanage? But the main character didn't even have time to answer, because Lala jumped in front of her to defend her. The little girl was angry and swore that if he kept talking to her like that, the two of them were going to have a problem, because anyone who talked that way to the princess was going right on the naughty list, even him. That was impressive, since Bianca had spent her whole life being protected by various knights, but the truth was, she had never felt as safe as she did in that moment. The little girl kept calling Ricardo stupid and didn't even give him room to speak. So going along with the little girl, Bianca suggests that unless he really wants to end up on the rude list, He'd better back off once and for all. A little while later, when the two of them were alone, the guy apologized and explained he had thought Bianca was following him. She pretended not to care, but deep down, she thought a future duke shouldn't apologize so easily. But Ricardo couldn't let go of the question of why Bianca had suddenly started helping the orphanage, since he had thought the Crawford family had no interest in doing charity work. But the girl pushed back, explaining that this had been a personal decision, one of her new interests, which was still a surprise even then. The main character comments that since Lala called him by his first name, it seemed like he visited that place pretty often, which our boy confirmed, explaining that the kids didn't even know he was nobility, which perfectly explained the simple clothes he was wearing there. Actually, to those children, he was just a random knight who taught the boys how to fight. He explained that there were some commoners who joined the Order of Knights and even if they didn't reach very high ranks, could at least earn a decent salary to live a more stable life. And that seemed like an excellent plan. Ricardo wasn't just giving money to the orphanage, he was teaching the boys to fend for themselves, which would probably be more useful in the long run. Plus, since he was a top knight of the empire, his students would certainly be very qualified in the future, not to mention that a letter of recommendation from the Duke would guarantee they could get into any cavalry they wanted. Curious, the girl asked if the girls also learned to use swords, and the boy explains that he taught those who showed interest, even though it wasn't that easy for women to become part of the cavalry, and since they knew that, almost none of them showed much interest actually. But in that case, the future for those girls was very limited. Even the guy himself didn't really know what happened, he had just heard the director mention that they ended up either getting married or going to work on the streets once they were older. And since they didn't have any very relevant skills, they always ended up in terrible jobs. Our girl could even picture Lala with red hands from the cold, washing clothes in the middle of winter to scrape together some money, and that image made her chest hurt intensely just thinking about it. She couldn't understand how anyone could do something like that to a child, especially one as adorable as Lala. Still, even more than that, she couldn't understand why she was so worried about a little girl she had just met. Even so, she comments that it wasn't fair for the boys to have a chance while the girls were left hanging like that. But Ricardo pointed out that becoming a knight and learning to handle a sword wasn't as simple as it seemed, because in the end, being a knight meant going to war. And going to war was brutal. People died, places turned to ruins, and no matter where you went, you could hear desperate crying echoing everywhere. Bianca had never heard such heavy words come out of her fiancé/U00E9's mouth. But there he was now, admitting that he remembered that horror very vividly to the point of having nightmares about it sometimes. The guy's eyes went so empty in that moment that it looked like he might disappear right there, and the main character had never seen him so vulnerable before, which was truly striking. It was also when he confessed that he only helped the orphanage to try to make up for his own sins. It was ironic that they were encouraging kids to become knights, even knowing all the horrors of war, but that was the only skill he could offer. The girl moved closer slowly, wondering if he had been suffering alone this whole time. Even during the moments she felt completely ignored by her fiancé/U00E9, there was no way she could have known what his life was like from his own perspective. She gently takes his hand. She didn't want to lose him at all, and a bit awkwardly confessed she didn't know what to say, but her thoughts were racing. While holding Ricardo's hand totally nervous, the girl felt she needed to find some comforting word to say. Luckily, our boy was the one who spoke first, calling her name and wrapping his hand around hers more firmly, which instantly made her go red as a tomato. The guy thanked her, a sincere thank you, which left her even more flustered because this had never happened before. It was the first time she was hearing those words of gratitude come directly from his mouth, directed at her. No matter how much she had tried to become his duchess in the past, she couldn't get the guy to say those things to her. After the first time, he admitted he had started seeing Bianca differently, discovering a side of her he hadn't known, and being perfectly honest, the girl comments that this had been the longest conversation the two of them had had since the day they met. He stands up and extends his hand to the noblewoman, inviting her to leave. Of course they had held hands before, but she had never felt this much warmth coming from the guy. Before saying goodbye, the girl comments that Mr. Wensbury was going to throw a ball soon and the invitation would arrive by the end of the day, and Ricardo promised he would be there to take her. As he opened the door, the girl's heart was nearly jumping out of her chest from all the anticipation, and our boy calls her suddenly, commenting that she was a bit flushed and asking if she had a fever by any chance. If she didn't have one before, she certainly did now. Nervous, the main character steps back, saying everything was fine and she must have just spent too long in the sun, but he didn't need to worry. Then she ran down the hallway to hide it. Ricardo was looking directly at her, not staring into space the way he usually did with that disinterested look that almost always occupied his face. This time, his eyes were fixed on her without a doubt. As she ran, her heart was pounding frantically, and the girl wondered if that was a good sign or a bad omen of what was still to come. Days later, on one of her carriage rides, the girl let out such a deep sigh that Pa_U00F1A asked if something was wrong. She tried to play it off, saying everything was fine, but in reality she had received the detailed report she'd asked the butler for about Maria the day before. It turned out the young woman really did exist, although the butler hadn't confirmed whether she was actually Mr. Winsbury's daughter or not. The girl lived with her sick mother and everything matched exactly what was written in the book. She also found out that Mr. Winsbury had gone to the city of Inchine to recover from a war wound when he was younger, and the woman who took care of him was Maria's mother. Everything was playing out just like it was in the book. And since that seemed to be the case, the rest of it had to be true, too. This was driving her crazy. Did that mean she was really going to die and couldn't do anything about it? She got so lost in her own thoughts that she didn't even notice when they arrived at their destination. The carriage stopped right in front of the city's bookstore, and the girl was greeted with a big smile by the same young man she had already met before. She was surprised he was waiting for her return, but the man explains he had changed his label system just as she had recommended. He didn't know if it would be very effective, but he had a really good feeling about it. Bianca didn't pay much attention to that and just said she was there to buy another book. In response, he asked what she'd like to read. So the girl explained she needed books about war injuries, panic disorders, psychological treatments, and that sort of thing. And her passion for such deep subjects made the attendant laugh. She had zero patience and told him to bring everything available on those topics. She could buy the entire bookstore if she had to. While he was gathering the volumes, the girl noticed a specific book on the shelf. It was The Journey of the Dandelion Princess. She thought of Lala right away. The little girl loved princesses and had even saved her from Ricardo. So she had a great idea, it would be a perfect gift to thank her for that kindness. So Bianca calls for the guy, who was already exhausted from stacking so many volumes, and asks him to wrap up all the fairy tales they had available, which left him in complete shock. When she got back to the orphanage, she ran straight into Ricardo again, who commented that their paths had crossed once more. She asks if he really went to that place that often. And our boy explains that unless he had a major commitment, he usually stopped by 2 or 3 times a week. After all, his students needed practice. But the Duke was curious to know why she was there. And the main character explained she had brought some books as a gift for the children. In reality, she had brought an entire library in that carriage, but to her it was nothing. So the guy decides to call the kids to help unload, while Bianca just stood there completely mesmerized staring at him, watching the drop of sweat slide down to his neck, and trying to pull herself together in front of that gorgeous man right in front of her. The boys arrived quickly to help empty the carriage, super happy and thanking the noble woman non-stop, until Lala came running to find Princess Bianca, being warned by her friend that she was going to fall if she kept running like that. And sure enough, the little girl crashed right into her princess's skirt. Excited, she asked why the main character hadn't told her she was coming, saying that as soon as Nicole told her she was there, she ran all the way to the garden. A bit awkwardly, the girl explained she had just arrived, so the little one hadn't missed much. Her friend enchanted with the main character and showered her with compliments about her beauty. Apparently, our girl wasn't very used to kids, because she just answered that she knew she was pretty. A small laugh from Ricardo caught her attention right away. She had no idea what he found so funny about that, but she didn't get to think about it much because the little girl pulled her attention back, and whispered that if Ricardo ever tried to mess with her again, she just had to say so, she'd put him back on the naughty list. Curious, the girl asks if Lala really thought our boy was scared of her, because the little girl was so cute, but the little one explained she was super scary and could even prove it, growling like a ferocious lion right in front of her, which only made the whole thing even more adorable. Looking at that scene, Bianca didn't know whether to lie and say she was scared or admit that it was the cutest thing she'd ever seen. It was impressively adorable how cute that little girl could be. She asked what the princess thought. Was she really scared? But before she could answer, Ricardo picked the little girl up, tickling her and saying he was saving the main character from the scary tiger there, before telling the little one to stop bothering the princess. But Lala didn't think she was doing that, she was just keeping her safe. Meanwhile, our girl was just standing there, mesmerized, watching him play so gently with that little girl. The guy comments that the princess was lucky to have Lala around to protect her, and then extended his hand to Bianca, who went completely red immediately, accepting the guy's help getting up. Seeing the two of them like that, the little girl commented that she had seen something like this in fairy tales, where the knight saves the princess. So apparently Ricardo wasn't a villain in this story. Delighted, she asks if the two of them were going to get married soon. The problem was that the princess in front of her was actually the villain, and for villains, the only possible fate was death. But Ricardo responded that maybe they would, and asked if, when that happened, Lala would come to the wedding, which she immediately confirmed. But Bianca had no idea why he had said something like that. Nicole calls her friend, telling her the main character had brought books for them, and there were even princess stories, which got the little girl excited, who ran off quickly to see the new arrivals. With the two of them alone, the main character asked why he had said that silly thing. But to Ricardo, it wasn't a big deal, and he questioned if it was forbidden to say something like that. After all, the whole country knew this marriage was going to happen. But the girl pushes back, saying she thought he had no interest at all in marrying her. Every time they had discussed it in the past, the guy stayed neutral, just saying maybe or who knows. And it's not that he had a careless personality, he just genuinely didn't care about marrying her. But now there he was, with a smile on his face, saying that to children. What could have changed in the meantime? Ricardo finally speaks up, saying he wasn't very interested in the subject, but he also never said he wasn't going to keep his engagement promise. Bianca was about to explode with rage, wanting to know who he thought he was talking so casually like that. The boy repeats what he had said, "I never said I wouldn't marry you." And our girl tries to find the right words to fire back. But she's interrupted when the little girl comes back into the garden, screaming for your majesty. Lala was holding the book in her hands and really wanted the princess to read it to her. To be nice, the woman explained she was a little busy right now, so the little one could read it herself, but the little girl explained she didn't know how to read, which completely threw Bianca off. She crouches down to try to understand the situation and asks why she couldn't read. But Lala didn't know how to explain it, so she just said because she didn't. Trying to help, the guy kneels in front of the girl and suggests she ask her friend Nicole to read the book for her. But the little one explains she really wanted the princess to read it, so he promises that Bianca would read it to her later. After all, she was a good girl and knew how to wait. Finally, the little girl runs off inside, yelling for Nicole. And now that they were alone, Ricardo takes the opportunity to explain that most of the children didn't learn to read until they were older. After all, there was nobody there to teach them. Naively, Bianca asked why the nannies didn't do that, or a private tutor. But of course, that was completely out of reach for most people. The guy decides to give his possible fiancé /U00E9 a reality check, explaining that most children were raised by their mothers or just grew up on their own, including orphans like Lala, who learned to read even later. And some never did at all. Our girl wasn't going to let Lala grow up like that. She was such a cute and sweet child. How could they expect her to grow up on her own? What was she, grass that didn't even need water? That made Bianca realize that was why she couldn't quite understand what the girl said sometimes. Her thoughts weren't very logical because she couldn't read. She was so focused on the little girl that Ricardo had to call her attention to come back to the topic of their marriage. But the main character had bigger priorities. The education of those children was certainly more important than their relationship. The boy is a little shocked and asks if she hadn't once said she hated children. But that wasn't quite the case, which surprises our guy a bit. A little awkwardly, Bianca explains she just didn't approach them first. She always waited for them to come to her. He was so shocked by her interest that he ended up getting too close. She didn't know what the boy was doing, but she had gotten a little nervous with all that closeness. Trying to change the subject, the girl stutters, saying she was going to talk to the director about increasing her donations a bit so they could hire a teacher. So she runs inside with Lala. Leaving Ricardo surprised, he had understood that she was a completely different person from the reality he thought. Finally, it was time to leave. But there was a problem. The main character's horse absolutely refused to move, and the coachman asked Bianca what to do, as if she actually had a good answer for that. Another carriage passing by noticed what was happening, and its coachman asked what the problem was. So Bianca's driver explains the horse wouldn't budge and was probably exhausted from hauling all those heavy books, which was a very bad sign for her. Until the door of the carriage next to them opened, revealing Ricardo, who said he could take Bianca home to the Crawford estate. It was a surprise that that car was part of his fleet, but she quickly understood he had probably asked for a simpler ride to avoid drawing attention from the kids. The coachman is grateful, but when he turns around to say something to Bianca, she's glaring at him furiously for not even asking if she would accept the ride. Now there was no turning back, so head down. The girl apologized for the trouble caused. The trip between the two was silent and awkward, until Ricardo finally broke the ice by commenting on all the books in the carriage. Dryly, the girl explained, she liked to read a lot, and he had already heard those comments about her reading habits. But military manuals, books about war trauma, and soldiers after combat were a little different from what he imagined she liked to read. So he commented that they were pretty interesting titles, since it was unusual to think of a high society lady who liked reading about war and corpses, but his comment just made her even more nervous, knowing she shouldn't have gotten into that carriage. Before he could even suggest anything, the girl was already making it clear she had only bought those books out of academic curiosity, and it had nothing to do with him. Which wasn't exactly what Ricardo was going to ask, which made the atmosphere between them even more awkward and heavy. And the poor girl spent the rest of the trip home mentally scolding herself for that. When she finally reached her destination, Ricardo was alone in his office, settling back into his routine. He was secretly happy because he had seen a new side of Bianca that day. Before he had seen the girl as a beautiful but still cold woman, driven by power and very arrogant. On top of everything, she was his fiancée /U00E9, destined to marry him just to inherit his lineage because of a promise made between their families. But now he couldn't believe the main character truly hated children. Flashbacks of the past come to him at that moment. A beautiful little girl was getting messy with the cake in her hands at a party. The nobles around them were laughing, thinking she was so cute. And Ricardo was also happy next to his fiancée /U00E9, until he heard her murmur with disdain that it was a complete mess. That had surprised our boy negatively at the time. Bianca's face was cold, as if she disapproved of it completely. Of course it was a mess, it was a cake being squished, but kids did that sort of thing. When she noticed she was being watched, she asked what his problem was. But she didn't get anything back. Just a cold look from Ricardo, who was already distant in his own thoughts. He had once dreamed of this life, living happily ever after with an amazing woman and an adorable little child. He wanted to hand off his heir title to the Weinkweiser Duchy and live peacefully in a quiet place with his family. But the reality was that nobody else could take that position from him. He couldn't just abandon his responsibilities and go live in the countryside. So at the very least, he wanted to build a happy, peaceful family, and that was his one remaining wish to survive the horrors of war. But he knew that would never happen while he was with Bianca. Because even if they got married, she would be more interested in her title as Duchess than her role as a wife. Or at least that's what he thought until that moment. Now the idea he had of Bianca was different. He remembered her saying she didn't hate children. He remembered the books she bought and how she didn't know what to say to comfort him. But she was there for him anyway. She had truly changed. No, it wasn't that she had changed. She had always been a good person. She just didn't show that side to the people around her. Every time he imagined his future family, the face of his wife was like a blur. But now things were getting clearer and clearer. It was Bianca. Bianca was Ricardo's chosen one, by his own will. So our boy decided it was time to start planning that wedding once and for all. Meanwhile, Bianca had finally received the detailed report about Maria from her butler. The girl was a beautiful, kind, pitiful young woman who stayed cheerful despite the difficult circumstances of her life. It must have been very hard growing up without knowing her own father, and she had probably faced a lot of poverty and judgment throughout the years. But from the very beginning, she had done her best to overcome those barriers. No matter how much she studied, her job options were limited to domestic service for noble families, so her financial situation hadn't improved one bit. And to make things worse, her mother had worked so hard she ended up getting sick. God had truly given her a very difficult fight to face. Even so, Maria fought hard and cared for her sick mother, always with a smile on her face. While reading that, Bianca couldn't understand why she was destined to destroy a girl who needed so much help. She reminded her a little of Panya, who had to take care of her father and younger siblings, and also brought to mind Lala, who was always smiling. But it was exactly that parallel that made our girl so anxious. How could such a sweet and innocent person like Maria turn into the villain of the story, steal Ricardo's heart, and threaten her own life? Just remembering that cold blade in her destiny made her throat hurt. Staring at that report, it became even more confusing for the main character to decide what to do with her archenemy, whom she hadn't even personally met. She couldn't kill her, but she also couldn't help her much. Fortunately, to distract her, the day of Wednesbury's ball arrived, and the people in the ballroom simply couldn't take their eyes off Bianca, who was stunning, as always. The girl greets Lady Evelyn, saying she also looked lovely, but the lady pushed back, saying that no matter how much she dressed up, she would never come close to the natural elegance of Miss Crawford. Our girl smiled politely at the compliments received, but she knew it was pure flattery, since she could tell from the woman's expression that something was genuinely bothering her. That's when the lady commented that she had heard Bianca was very engaged in several charity, but she found the news strange because she didn't think that was a Crawford family interest. After all, they had much more practical values. So when she found out it was the girl's own idea, she praised her, saying the young lady had a heart of gold. It seemed Leanne had kept her promise and was efficiently spreading the rumors about her kind heart. And the main character could only hope the gossip would keep going and more people would know how kind she could be. Evelyn also comments that Lord Weinkeezer was a very lucky man to be engaged to a woman as good as Bianca, but she was modest, answering that she didn't think she was all that. And speaking of the fiancé, Ricardo approaches the two of them, politely greeting Lady Evelyn, who immediately praises him, saying he looked spectacular that day. After exchanging the usual pleasantries, the woman decided to leave the two of them alone, wishing them a lovely afternoon. As soon as she walked away, the gossip flew fast among the other noble women in the ballroom, even faster than the main character herself expected. The thing was, her fiancé /U00E9 had also heard some things, some specific rumors. He had heard that in addition to helping orphanages, the girl was also offering assistance to homeless shelters and retirement homes, which made her smile from the corner of her mouth, explaining it was simply a new personal interest. But he remembered that at the shelter she had said her only business was helping orphanages. So our boy wanted to know why she was so interested in doing all these good deeds out of nowhere. You could see from the sparkle in Ricardo's eyes that he wanted to truly understand what was going on, visibly curious about this sudden change. But that only helped the main character's plan even more. She explains naturally that she had a lot of money to spare, and also he should know one thing. She had always been a good person. This was her chance to make that very clear, not just to Ricardo, but to everyone there. The guy was caught off guard and ended up blushing like a tomato before responding that apparently he didn't know her as well as he thought. Friendly, he extends his hand to the girl and invites her to dance. That was absolutely new. What had gotten into him? The Duke didn't even like dancing, and he had already done it earlier that same afternoon. Of course Bianca wasn't going to turn down an offer like that, so she accepted the invitation despite the initial shock, handing over her hand gently to the guy. The noble women around them immediately started commenting on the moment. They thought the couple was a perfect match, truly. He guides the girl with extreme gentleness, and the violins follow their rhythm. That was Bianca's favorite music, which only helped improve the mood between them. They begin to spin around the ballroom in an engaging dance, even if it was a very rehearsed step. Even so, all that was going through the main character's mind was that she needed to find out more about Maria, and for that she had to talk to Mr. Wensbury, but she had no idea where to start. It's not like she could just walk up to him and ask, "Hi, did you ever get involved with a servant girl from the city of Ensign back in the day? Do you have an illegitimate daughter?" Ricardo noticed she was distant and asked what she was thinking about so intensely. A little awkwardly, she explained it was just random things about life, so the guy asked if she shouldn't be focused on her partner while they were dancing in the ballroom. Our girl had no idea why now, all of a sudden, her fiancé /U00E9 was making such a point of having her attention. She couldn't even remember the last time they had danced, and he looked into her eyes as if the two of them were truly in love, since Ricardo always stared into space. But he was definitely looking right into her eyes at that moment. It was very different behavior from the Ricardo she knew and was used to. The two of them looked at each other with a surreal magnetism, and the girl felt herself blushing more than ever. Suddenly he whispers her name very close to her ear, pulling her closer by the waist, and the two continue in that incredible dance that left her completely hypnotized. Then murmuring in her ear with his head almost resting against her chest, Ricardo comments that she looked beautiful that day, an unexpected compliment that managed to leave her even more flustered. That is to say, this man who had looked down on her just a little while ago, this gorgeous imposing man had just complimented her like that. Out of nowhere. When the dance finally ended, the nobles around them applauded the two of them since it was truly a lovely scene to see. But the girl quickly made up some excuse about touching up her makeup and ran off, leaving the poor guy standing alone in the middle of the ballroom completely at a loss. As soon as she reached the bathroom, she found herself completely worked up, trying every way possible to understand what had gotten into him to act like that. Could she have looked so beautiful the day that he finally realized he should fall for her? No, that was simply impossible and made absolutely no sense. They had been theoretically engaged for 10 years, and in every single one of those moments, she had presented herself the same way, gorgeous. So Ricardo would never just fall for her like that out of nowhere. The Duke had probably just made a mistake when he said those sweet things. Our girl was already heading back to the main ballroom when she heard someone calling her. She knew that voice very well. She found it extremely annoying. Maybe there was still time for her to run and disappear into the crowd, or at least that's what she thought, because a heavy hand soon landed on her shoulder, and a guy with pink hair, wearing a friendly smile, asked her not to ignore him because he'd be hurt. After all, it had been quite a while since the two of them had last seen each other. There was no mistaking that man. The pink hair and violet eyes were characteristics exclusive to the royal family of the Splendor Empire. Formally, the girl greets a cell-blank Cartagento, the royal prince, but he insisted she didn't need so much formality and that she could just call him by his first name. But the girl explains she would never dare do that, even though he pushes back by saying Bianca never had a problem with that closeness before, so he insists she just call him Assel. Even so, our main character holds her ground, asking how she could help your royal highness. That man was truly annoying and kept insisting on the name thing. Luckily, Bianca also knew how to be stubborn and made it clear she wasn't going to do it. She was already ready to turn away, saying that if there was nothing else to discuss, she'd better go. But he asked her to wait a bit longer. The nobleman didn't know what else to do to break through her walls, and she, for her part, just hoped the two of them would go their separate ways as quickly as possible. So extending his hand to her with a smile, he had an idea. What if the two of them danced together? The main character had to admit he was good with words and knew this was just a flimsy excuse. But the truth was, you don't say no to a future king, so she didn't have much of a choice. But just as the main character was about to accept the invitation, a firm voice echoed behind the two of them calling her name. It was Ricardo, who greeted his royal highness without showing much enthusiasm until the Duke fixed his gaze on a specific detail. His fiancée /U00E9's hand was almost touching the prince's hand. Our boy gave a quick bow and Assel asked him to stand up. He didn't need to be so stiff. In fact, it had been a good while since the two of them had crossed paths. But the tension between them was perfectly noticeable. With an uncomfortable silence settled among the three of them, Assel asks if that's all, and Ricardo simply confirms it, prompting the heir to comment that the Duke hadn't changed one bit. So the prince turns to Bianca, suggesting the two of them head straight to the ballroom. However, Ricardo placed his own hand over his fiancée /U00E9's fingers right at that moment and apologized for the interruption, before firmly holding his partner, making it clear that Bianca was his companion that evening. That was a huge surprise. Usually the guy didn't act with that much jealousy or possessiveness. The girl was loving that scene behind the scenes and kept looking back and forth between the Duke and the prince, curious to see where it was going to end. Assel laughs from the corner of his mouth, saying he knew that after all, they had been partners since the engagement was set, and everyone in every social circle in Splendor knew about that arrangement. Coldly, Ricardo comments that since he already knew that, there was nothing more that needed to be explained because Bianca was going to dance with him now, something that leaves the girl a little caught in the crossfire. With an unbearable smile on his face, the pink-haired guy asks if they hadn't already danced, which the Duke promptly confirms, without bothering to explain much. So Assel argues that by Splendor's customs, everyone could dance with whoever they wanted, after granting the first dance to their official partner, asking if the circumstances had changed. But that wasn't quite the case. The Duke simply explains that since the main character was his partner, the preference was entirely his, which leaves the prince somewhat offended. The nobleman details that he didn't have much time to attend these parties outside of the imperial ball, but had managed to find a gap that day and wanted the guy to be a little more flexible. But Ricardo kept his hard expression and stared down the prince with pure disdain. Meanwhile, the heir looked like a spoiled child, insisting on dancing with Bianca and claiming that they had agreed before his rival showed up. He even turns to the girl, hoping she'll finally take his hand. However, the atmosphere in the hallway got really heavy and Ricardo pointed out that it didn't seem like the main character had actually accepted the invitation. Assel was already starting to get heated when he said she had been very close to accepting and the other guy just hadn't seen it because he didn't want to since their fingers had even touched. But the Duke was acting like he didn't understand the situation. The two of them turned together to the poor girl, hoping to get a confirmation, and she found herself more lost than ever. The main character didn't even know what to say. After all, this whole fight over a simple dance was completely surreal. Luckily, a voice from the hallway called for His Royal Highness, which stressed him out even more with the interruption. It was his personal escort, warning that it was time for him to head back, even though the nobleman felt like he had just arrived. In reality, it had been exactly 53 minutes since the prince's arrival, and he should have left 18 minutes ago, so it was best to head back to the palace to handle all his royal duties. Relieved by the interruption, the couple bows before the prince in farewell, saying it was a pleasure, even though the annoyance in Asel's eyes was obvious. So he dramatically turns his back, commenting that he would sacrifice his frail little body for the good of the Empire's security. Honestly, that assistant had saved the day, and Bianca finally felt like she could breathe properly again. Now that they were alone, Ricardo smiled gently as he extended his hand, calling his dear fiancé /U00E9 back to the dance floor. The main character even shuddered at the word fiancé /U00E9. Since when had our boy started calling her that with such affection? The girl's face was frozen, an expression of confusion, terror, and anxiety all at once. And of course Ricardo noticed, so he called her name to ask if she was alright. Whispering, she asked if the Duke had actually just called her his fiancé /U00E9. He confirms it, also in a whisper. That was shocking. It had never happened before, and Ricardo said that from now on he was going to do it often. Had our boy eaten something that had gone bad? Bianca even wondered if the tea she drank at the orphanage hadn't been any good. He didn't get too into it, just asked if she'd grant him one more dance. It was already the third time that night he had asked. Of course the girl accepted, but she couldn't help asking if he was alright, which left him even more confused. And she explained she simply didn't know Ricardo liked dancing so much. To her surprise, the guy answers he didn't really enjoy it that much, so she wanted to understand what the real reason behind all these invitations was. So he reveals that he knew that if he wasn't the one dancing with her, other men certainly would. They were standing way too close, and the main character's heart was pounding when she asked what other men he was talking about. The guy started pointing out 3 guys in the ballroom who had been staring at his fiancée /U00E9 since the moment she walked in. There was Mr. Wensbury's son, a random bodyguard at the party, and his 60-year-old count, which was kind of insulting to even suggest. But she didn't even have time to say anything, because Ricardo was already commenting that the main character was very popular in high society, which was, at the very least, interesting for him to say. When the Duke asked if she had always been this famous, the girl just echoed his comment about his interest, which left him a little confused. That was all she needed to go into complete meltdown. What did he mean? Why? She was the most beautiful woman in the Splendor Empire and came from a very influential, wealthy family. And the list of praise just kept growing, so she had plenty of obvious qualities. The penny was finally dropping. Ricardo had never had the slightest interest in her in the past. Never. Confident, but with fury in her eyes, our girl explained that she was the perfect woman and that was why she was so popular. The Duke asked if she always talked about herself like that, which made her ask if he thought that wasn't the absolute truth. She was fully committed to the conversation now, so she decided to go for it and made it clear that he was the only person who treated her like she was garbage. That surprises him enormously. There was no way the main character actually thought that about him. Trying to soften the weight of the comment a bit, she explained it wasn't like she was garbage in the middle of the street. It was more like a candy wrapper he carried around in his pocket. The mood between the two of them was obviously terrible and heavy, and the guy asks if Bianca was angry with him. Her smile seemed to hide a deep rage. Even so, the main character insisted she would never be angry with her master, who was kind enough to carry her around in his pocket. She was definitely furious and she no longer knew how shameless Ricardo could be. She didn't deserve to be treated that way and she was fully aware of it. She was starting to wonder what had made her want to marry a man who wasn't actually interested in her, and in that moment she felt almost grateful for having found that cursed book. She was Bianca Crawford, after all. She had no reason to put up with this kind of treatment from anyone. When she finally thought about confronting him for real, she was interrupted by the guy's comment that it was the first time he had seen her so stressed. Actually, he was seeing many new sides of Bianca lately. Little did the Duke know that was only the beginning, so she hoped he enjoyed it. But the guy didn't seem resentful. In fact, he was having way too much fun with the situation. He was smiling like a fool, saying it was very entertaining to learn new things about the girl. And that completely destabilized her. Ricardo was actually smiling. A truly bright smile for the first time since they could remember. She was so hypnotized by that scene that the guy had to ask if she was alright. She didn't know how to answer yes or no, because that expression took her back to a place she had forgotten she had been. That tender smile was the same one she had seen on Ricardo's face when he was still a young innocent boy. A truly pure smile. One day later, the girl went to meet Lord Wensbury, who greeted her with a warm smile on his face. She asks if she had kept him waiting too long because she had tried to leave right on time. But he asks her not to worry. He had arrived early. That was Renard Winsbury, the only son of Mr. Winsbury and legitimate heir to the Marquis title. It was almost unsettling how similar he was to his own father when the man was younger. People at court even joked that they could swap photos of each other and no one would suspect the switch. But unlike his father, who had once been a renowned and very stubborn knight, Riard was sweet and obedient. Two sides of the same coin. The girl confesses she had been a little surprised when he called her for a private conversation like that. And that leaves Riard visibly nervous, prompting him to explain he didn't want to cause any misunderstanding or disrespect the fiancé/U00E9 of Lord Weinkeezer. Seeing all that panic over something like that just made things seem even more suspicious to Bianca. But since she was already there wasn't much to do but listen. So he explains that actually, he had wanted to talk to her during the ball, but he'd heard she had left early. Because after that whole situation with Ricardo, it was much better to just go home. Of course, Bianca wasn't going to admit that to the Marquis' son, so she just explained she hadn't been feeling very well that day. Honestly, all she wanted was to forget that night, once and for all. Worried, the boy asks if she's okay now, saying he wouldn't have called and asked her to come all the way there if he'd known she was unwell. But she explains she's fine, she had no idea why he was so nervous. It was like a teenager meeting their crush for the first time. Even though he had turned 25 that year, Reinhard still didn't have a defined fiancé/U00E9. He had been engaged before to the daughter of another Marquis, but they had to break off the engagement and since then, he's been single. There was even a strong rumor going around that he had a crush on a Marquis daughter. Maybe it was his ex-fiancé/U00E9, whom he still hadn't gotten over. But that wasn't Bianca's concern. She just wanted to know why she was there that particular day. The boy was very disoriented and explained he had something a little embarrassing to tell her. He started rambling, saying that since she was such an exemplary charity figure, he had tried to get past that embarrassment in the hope that she could help. That was quite an inconvenience for the main character. Did he think that just because she had started making donations, she was now open to doing social work for everyone? The boy was tapping his fingers nervously, stumbling over his words, trying to say the right thing. Our girl was already tired of the drawn-out situation, so with a friendly smile, she said that if it was too difficult, they could meet another time. But the guy absolutely wasn't going to let that happen, and said he was going to tell her the truth. Then he started talking about what actually mattered. It turned out there was an illegitimate child in his family. And hearing that makes Bianca's eyes go wide in shock, even though she already knew this perfectly well from the book. The boy quickly clarifies it wasn't his illegitimate child. Honestly, Bianca would have preferred if that were the case. But he explains that apparently his father had been involved with a woman when he was much younger. The girl asked if it was possible that this woman was lying, and of course that had been considered by the family. So they checked the entire background to be absolutely sure. Runard tells that when his father was younger, he recovered in a small rural town from a combat wound. And during that time, he got close to one of the maids who had taken care of him. When he did the math to see if the child's date of birth matched the period of his father's recovery, he had the uncomfortable certainty that it wasn't a lie. He had also considered the possibility that she could be another man's daughter, of course. But the physical resemblance between the two was undeniable, which left Bianca even more unsettled by the situation. The thing was, his father had already decided what to do about it. He wanted to adopt this illegitimate daughter so she could officially join the family, which meant Riyadh had already personally met Maria. Of course, his mother was completely against the idea, but he knew his father was going to get what he wanted one way or another in the end. She was already in the capital, close enough to destroy everything Bianca had worked for, which wasn't much to begin with. She could hear the boys saying they planned to educate this girl. After all, she probably knew almost nothing about high society. The story was progressing exactly like in the book. Even though it was late, the girl would have a debutante ball and enter high society directly through the influential Winsbury family. But he still had one serious concern in mind. And as shameless as it was to ask, he wanted to talk to Bianca in the hope that she could help that poor girl integrate. Wow, the girl froze immediately. And in a desperate move, she decided to ask for the woman's name right away. Maybe fate would smile and it was someone else. But to her complete bad luck, Reinhard answered that his half-sister's name was Maria Valona, immediately correcting himself to Maria Wensbury. Her tragic fate was sealed. There was nothing left to do to escape. That cursed story was going to drag on very slowly and lead the main character inevitably to her beheading, without a doubt. When she got home that night, the girl simply couldn't sleep, staring at the book in complete desperation. What could she do to turn the situation around? At this point in the plot, Ricardo and Maria were certainly going to meet very soon. And once that happened, it would be her definitive end. For a brief moment, she thought about having the girl killed. But she quickly scolded herself just for considering such cruelty. That was exactly the kind of attitude that had led to her cold execution in the book. Besides, if she killed someone, every single one of her days would become endless nightmares. Above all, even if the romantic connection between the two hadn't been formed yet, killing her was the biggest reason she died in the book. So it would be a very dangerous move. At that moment, she clearly remembered Ricardo's empty gaze when he talked about the horrors of war. Did he remember the people he had taken the lives of every night when he dreamed? Did those people, wherever they were, hold grudges against him and curse him through the night? Following that line of thought, Bianca wondered if, in the original book, Ricardo still had nightmares because he had killed her. The girl drummed her fingers on the book, not quite knowing what to do to change the course of things. There was exactly 1 week left, until St. George's Day, which meant the predetermined meeting between Maria and Ricardo, written by the author, was about to happen. She didn't know how, but she had to urgently find a way to prevent her own death. That's when she came up with a great plan of action. She could prevent the two of them from meeting at that festival. If she changed their geographical destinations, they would never fall for each other. So that was exactly what she needed to do. At the end of the tunnel, a real light of hope suddenly appeared for the main character. The next day, she went to meet her fiancé, making him an irresistible proposal for St. George's Day. She was visibly nervous, as she said she hoped that the two of them could spend the whole day together, alone. That way, she could successfully prevent his meeting with Maria. But it was a somewhat sudden proposal for Ricardo, who thinks in silence, a little flushed at that romantic possibility. Being perfectly honest, the main character didn't even know the Duke could make such a cute expression. Then the guy explains he was honored by the invitation. But there was a small problem in his schedule. He had made a prior unavoidable commitment, and the word commitment completely threw the girl off. She jumped off the sofa asking who that commitment was with. Maybe he had already met Maria behind her back? A little wary of her reaction, he asks if the girl really wants to know, which she confirms, desperate to find out every detail of his life. So the guy explains he had promised the orphanage children that he would take them to enjoy the St. George's Day festival, which completely shattered our girl's tragic expectations. This whole Maria business had to end once and for all, or she would lose her mind very soon, taking advantage of the opening from his fiancée /U00E9. Very nervous about what he was going to suggest, our boy explains he had been thinking about something, whether the woman might like to come along with them on the festival day. That was complete madness in her head. She could clearly picture herself with Lala on one arm and Ricardo on the other, chatting in the middle of that public chaos. What did all of this even mean? The guy had finally asked her on a real date, but they would be surrounded by pure chaos on all sides. On St. George's Day, a procession took place at the temple to honor that deity. Meanwhile, in the streets of cities and villages, a big festival took over, with all kinds of food and different attractions. But our girl looked completely shocked by the noisy place. She hides behind Ricardo and asks if by any chance a war had broken out there and nobody told her. But the guy explains it was just the local celebration. This was something completely new for Bianca, who watched people shouting and wondered if there shouldn't be more music and if the other people weren't supposed to actually be having fun. After all, nobody had told Bianca the event would be this chaotic. There were even kids crying in the middle of the street. Her attention was grabbed by Lala, who tugged her arm insistently and asked what she was waiting for. It was time to have fun. The poor girl was in total despair and even tried to argue with the little girl, because she didn't feel even a little bit ready to face that crowd. Until she noticed something. Even with all those people, nobody was fighting and everyone seemed to be having a really good time. She had been so overwhelmed by that new environment that she hadn't noticed at first that the people screaming were just vendors selling their products. There were even games to play. And the crying child had stopped the moment someone handed them a lollipop. So this was a legitimate festival. It wasn't a horrible place to be, after all. Suddenly, something caught Lala's full attention. She screamed, pointing at a doll there, and calls for Bianca, who was still trying to get used to that strange day. The main character crouches down and asks if the child wants that toy, already ready to buy it for her. Still, she couldn't help noticing that everything in that place was excessively loud and very dirty. She had to play a game to win the doll, and one of the orphan boys who was with them offered to do the challenge, cheered on enthusiastically by Lala. The boy proudly pulls a rat from inside the fence, making the little girl scream with joy while Bianca just watches the scene, completely shocked that she had gotten so excited just because a kid picked up a rat. Still, there was something in the middle of that mess that made up for the whole exotic experience. She stares at Lala holding the doll, thinking that a small part of herself was maybe having fun because if her favorite little kid was having a good day, that was all that mattered to Bianca. In the middle of the main character's internal agony, Ricardo let it slip that he was relieved by the situation, leaving the girl confused by the comment. But he explains that even though it had been his idea to invite the girl, he had still been a little worried considering the things he had already seen in her behavior, because it didn't seem like she would enjoy a popular place like that. However, her recent changes in behavior were noticeable, so he decided to risk the invitation and now felt he had made the right call. He sincerely thanks the girl for coming along with him on that day off, which leaves our girl confused, not quite knowing where all those unexpected compliments were coming from. The moment between the two of them is interrupted by the kids, who ask him to buy them juice because they were dying of thirst. And cheerfully, the guy pats their heads fondly, telling them they could get any flavor they wanted. The main character was even a bit surprised since she had never seen such soft expressions on the guy's face. Even when a boy asked to mix two flavors together, he didn't mind one bit. A man runs hurrying past the two of them, which catches Bianca's attention right away, and her heart practically jumps out of her chest when she hears someone yell, "Stop, thief," in the distance. The fleeing man quickly panics as a scene forms around him, roughly shoving poor Nicole out of the way so he can escape. The little girl falls right into Ricardo's arms, startled by that sudden push, and other people keep shouting to catch that thief. Quickly, the Duke asks Bianca to watch the kids for him, leaving her somewhat confused by the request. So the guy takes off running after that criminal, and our girl screams for him, worried about what Ricardo would do in the rush. At that exact moment, she realized something very important, so she asked Peter, who was the oldest of the kids, to keep an eye on them for a moment. She hadn't run because she was worried about her fiancé/U00E9's safety. She had run because the woman screaming for help had a very familiar voice in her memory. She kept running after Ricardo with the absolute certainty that she needed to stop him before the worst happened. She couldn't let the two of them meet there, no matter what it would cost her future. After running a long way through the festival, Ricardo managed to stop the man, pinning him to the ground with a firm shout. The thief was whimpering like a coward, saying he would return the money without complaint, and begging for his life to be spared while the Duke looked for the real owner of that bag of coins. Finally, Maria arrived at the scene, cursing the thief in anger. She was scolding him, saying he didn't even know what that hard-earned money in the bag was for. And she yells for anyone who wants to hear that it was for the hospital expenses, or her mother was in serious condition. All that bravery of the girl slowly faded away. When the girl noticed who the imposing man standing over the thief was, her eyes sparkle intensely when she sees Ricardo pinning down the man who had stolen all her charity money. And the two of them exchange brief, deep gazes. A little flustered by the situation, the young woman thanks him for the help, and the Duke simply extends the bag of coins toward her, asking if it was really hers, which the girl confirms with relief. Thanking him again, but before that sum could reach Maria's hands, the guy pulls the bag of coins back, asking if she had real proof that that money was actually hers, which leaves the girl completely in disbelief at the suspicion. But Ricardo didn't want excuses. He wanted real evidence that that money was hers, even though the girl was offended at being accused of lying in public. Bianca had finally found the two of them in the middle of the festival. She had read these lines so many times in the script that she had memorized the entire dialogue. They were saying exactly what was in the book, word for word. Ricardo keeps insisting on the check, saying he needed to confirm that bag belonged to the girl. He didn't want to give it to the wrong person. Apparently, the natural course of things couldn't be changed easily, no matter how hard Bianca tried to intervene. A little tired of the interrogation, Maria explains her name was properly embroidered on the bag because her mother had done it for her with love. The guy asks what her full name is, and Maria finally introduces herself to both of them without using any noble surname. He repeats the girl's name slowly, and Bianca was already certain the two of them were going to fall madly in love from that very moment. Even as she wondered if, even after the romantic connection between the two formed, Ricardo would end up slicing her throat at the end of the story. Apparently, there was nothing she could do to change the plot from the start, and now she was right there watching Maria ask what her fiancé/U00E9's name was. Our boy was just about to answer when he noticed something strange from the corner of his eye. Bianca, who was crying compulsively right in front of him, because she had the uncomfortable certainty of her own tragic fate. She knew that no matter how much she read or how hard she tried, the end of her life was going to remain the same tragically. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't even think straight, so she just had to get out of there, and so she did, running off with no direction, making Ricardo scream her name desperately, begging her not to go. But he couldn't just let the thief go in the middle of the crowd, so he was stuck in place. Even so, he really needed to know why his future fiancée was crying like that in the middle of the street. In fact, she had shown him many new sides of herself that festival day. For example, she had shown a confused expression when she first saw all that crowd. But shortly after, her reaction was completely happy. Not to mention how radiant she looked when she gave the doll as a present to Lala. Even if it was a strange reaction by her standards, he didn't hate what he saw. But he didn't want to see his girl cry under any circumstances. He was snapped out of his thoughts when Maria insisted he tell her his name. She wanted to know who to thank for recovering her money. Completely cold, the guy just says that wouldn't be the least bit necessary, even though she wants to insist. Without much patience, he says that if she truly wanted to repay someone, she should just pass the kindness forward to someone else in need. His words leave her deeply impressed. He was a man with absolutely no vanity, it seemed, which was hard not to find wonderful. The trip home was silent and tense, until Panya asked if her mistress was alright. She wanted to know if something serious had happened at the festival, because she didn't look well at all. But the girl changed the subject, saying she was fine and just felt a little scattered. Worried, the maid asks if it would be better to cancel the plans she had the next day. But our girl didn't even know what the maid was talking about, until she explained that the Marquis's daughter was going to visit the palace. She hadn't even remembered that was already the next day, which was a shame because she would have to keep those plans at all costs. And Bianca insists she'd be fine. The maid didn't need to worry so much. The next day, in her magnificent palace, a grand and elegant afternoon tea was served for the guest, who arrived introducing herself as Maria Villona, then immediately corrected herself awkwardly to Maria Wensbury. Without much enthusiasm, the main character asked Maria to sit down. She had to admit the girl had made an effort to get dressed for the occasion, but her hair was a complete mess. She also had a pretty face, she just looked a bit all over the place, overall. Even so, her expression was full of life. Her eyes were full of energy, and she had a smile that looked like that of a completely innocent child. Bianca, on the other hand, didn't have any of those sweet characteristics, not even if she tried. She goes wide-eyed when the girl suddenly comments that Lord Wensbury had said very good things about her, and she confirms they were specifically talking about Reinhard, something the girl confirms, saying he talked about Bianca all the time, and his father, Mr. Wensbury, too. They said she was a true lady that she should look up to as an example of conduct. If the main character stopped to think for a moment, that was actually her only strong point, becoming a perfect noblewoman and a very elegant duchess, but all her dreams could go down the drain because of that naive little girl. At that moment she even started to wonder if a random woman could really destroy her future that easily, and if the only thing she could do was silently watch her own end unfold. What had she done wrong to deserve all of that? Why did she have to die in the end? She even fantasized for a moment about Maria suddenly choking right there in front of her, dropping her cup in a macabre mix of tea and blood on the palace floor, coughing endlessly, unable to get air, and staring at her with pure horror in her eyes, desperately begging to be spared by Bianca. So as not to lose her life right there, she snapped out of that dark trance when the girl called her back. She had gone suddenly quiet and distant, and so Maria insisted on knowing if she was alright, since she hadn't received any response to her comment. Our girl smiles a little awkwardly, trying to distract herself from the dark thought, and asks what they had been talking about. Even though she found her airy reaction a bit strange, Maria just mentions that she had been asked why the girl had moved to the capital so suddenly, and to be completely honest, she explains that her mother hadn't been feeling very well lately, and given the financial circumstances, she couldn't cure her mother's illness on her own. Otherwise, she would have stayed living in the rural area of splendor. But she was very, very happy that the family had offered the necessary support, because she wanted to be able to help other people the same way someday, when she could. For some reason, the main character decided to be honest and explained that she didn't help others just because she was a good person, she just wanted other people to see her as a good person on the surface. But the girl asks if that didn't already make Bianca a much better person than most, which left her a little lost in her own judgments. So she explains she thought it was much harder to be kind than cruel in a world like that, and yet there was the Duchess doing good deeds all the time, which made her a good person even if she herself didn't recognize her own worth. That makes our girl go completely silent for a whole minute. Maybe Maria was right, maybe she really was a good person deep down, and the girl adds that she didn't need to care so much about what strangers said about her behind her back. Even if everyone in high society talked badly about her, that shouldn't be a real concern. In that moment, our girl realized that Maria did have a bright and captivating spirit. She could never hate or want to kill a woman as sweet as her. When the girl finally left, our main character watched her pensively from the window. A deep melancholy covered our girl at the end of that afternoon. She had never lived a life that was defined by someone else's existence or approval. She had only studied and worked hard to have the status she had at that moment, but now if she asked herself why she had made so much effort, she wouldn't know the answer. Later, the main character went to meet Ricardo, who asks surprised if he had heard right what the girl had just said, so she repeats the sentence firmly, saying seriously that she wanted to end their engagement once and for all, which left the guy completely shocked in her, internally even more shocked by her own courage. Flashbacks of when Bianca was a child come to her mind, and someone scolds her asking what she thinks she's doing. It was Azel. He was rudely criticizing her because the little girl had gotten his clothes dirty on purpose and demanding she apologize immediately, but the main character holds her ground firmly, saying it wasn't her fault. But the boy is very aggressive, asking whose fault it was then, whether she was seriously saying the juice had spilled itself, which clearly wasn't the case. Little Bianca was a nervous wreck. Her mother had expressly told her to stay out of trouble, and the whole thing had just been an honest mistake on her part. Someone interrupted the heated argument between the two, saying it had gone way past all limits. It was Ricardo with the same serious expression he has now as an adult, saying the prince was bothering the girl over pure nonsense. He could even lend his own clothes if that was the big issue, but for Azel, it wasn't just about that. Even so, the boy protects Bianca from the attacks, saying he understood his outfits would be much too big on him, but one day the boy would grow enough that it wouldn't be a problem anymore. The little girl just watched the two of them argue until Azel finally gave in, saying he didn't need to resolve anything and would change clothes himself, asking if now her and her savior were happy. Luckily, the prince's butler also called for him at the same time, saying it was time to go, but before leaving the two of them alone, he made it clear he wouldn't make things easy for Bianca next time. Now that it was just her and Ricardo, the girl asks him something, and she wanted to know why he had so openly taken her side in the whole argument. And friendly, the boy apologizes for the trouble, asking if by any chance the chair at the banquet table was too low for her, and explains he simply hadn't noticed that before and should have paid more attention to the actual needs of his guests. Still, the girl didn't understand why he was apologizing, but the Duke insists he hadn't thought enough about the comfort of one of his guests. She guessed she had felt safe enough in his presence to mention that her mother had said this apologizing thing was something only losers did and real ladies never put themselves in situations where they had to apologize in the first place. That makes the little Duke laugh a bit awkwardly at her pride, commenting that Bianca had already learned quite a lot of mature things for a child her age and that he had no doubt she would become a very respected noble lady in society. It was perhaps exactly that charming smile of the boy's that had stolen her heart for good. She had fallen head over heels for that sweet, warm smile, and from then on she started daydreaming about the day she would become his duchess. And look where she had ended up. But that love had made her forget, at least for a while, that her real priority wasn't becoming a duchess or marrying Ricardo at any cost. No, what truly mattered in this new chance was herself. And there she was now in the guy's office wearing her extremely elegant adult clothes, trying to remember with pride that she was Bianca Crawford while firmly telling Ricardo she wanted to end their engagement. Those shocking words still hadn't quite registered in the boy's head, and he asks if it hadn't been her who had begged for them to get engaged in the first place. But the woman explains they were both too young when they got engaged, and with all decisions made as children, that alliance had been very rushed. The thing was, as a child, she could only see what was right in front of her, and at that time her whole world was Ricardo. With no real expression, he comments that it seemed like the girl wanted to say there was no real sincerity behind her old decision. And the word sincerity makes our girl laugh. A wry and sincere laugh. Bianca asks how much more sincerity he needs to hear and then openly reveals that all she had wanted in the past was to become his duchess. As the youngest daughter of an influential marquis, it was natural to want to be the perfect girl at court, so it seemed like a great political position to be in. But now she recognized that there were far more precious things in the world, so she was just trying to correct her past mistakes. Even so, Ricardo doesn't understand why they had to end the engagement just like that, asking if by any chance there was another man involved, which leaves her somewhat offended by the insinuation. Was he really doubting her loyalty after all these years? It was a pretty unexpected reaction from him. She thought the guy was going to act completely indifferent and just go along with the separation, but to think he believed she was cheating on him with another guy when it was him who originally had plans to run off with another woman in the book. Above all, in that moment, all the girl wanted was to stay alive. Coldly, Ricardo says that if he were going to fall for another woman, the request to break off the engagement would be fully justified, but he guaranteed that would never happen. And finally, the Duke reveals what everyone had already suspected: he was deeply interested in Bianca. So no, he was not going to simply accept canceling their engagement. I would have jumped on that man right then and there if I were in the main character's place. The boy repeatedly refuses Bianca's request, and his firm words are enough to make that cursed book glow intensely in her bag, which immediately sparks a flicker of hope in the main character. Had the story actually changed direction? Did that mean Ricardo and she would finally live together in peace? At least she knew she could check the new ending of her life at that very urgent moment. She ran desperately to the palace library, flipping through the pages while trying to calm down and wrap her head around the idea that she might have become the actual lead. She quickly skimmed past the scenes that had now been altered when Maria and Ricardo met at the festival and she asked to know the hero's name. However, something crucial in the story hadn't changed at all. Maria, who had been afraid of everyone and everything in the capital, did develop deep feelings for the guy. She fell madly in love with him, but Bianca, who had previously filled the role of villain, now became Ricardo's first and true great love. But that didn't end well in the new plot, either. In one of the scenes described in the book, her porcelain teacup falls and shatters on the floor, and our girl keeps coughing up blood, growing weaker, kneeling humiliatingly in front of Maria, begging for a drop of mercy. The girl asks mockingly if the villain thought that was going to change Ricardo's feelings for her, a diapon of gauze, and with a completely unhinged look from the girl who had once seemed so innocent, she says no, but she states she has absolutely no problem with that. After all, even if she couldn't have her beloved's heart entirely, she would certainly have his lifeless body. What our girl reads on those pages makes her let out a loud scream of denial. For the love of God, why was she always the one ending up dead in some horrible way in her own story? She didn't know anymore if it was a curse or just God's will being done, but it seemed like the world wasn't going to rest until she was dead once and for all. Even so, Bianca wasn't going to give in so easily. The girl is received by Maria at the Winsbury residence with a lot of excitement and smiles. In that moment, all that mattered to our girl was doing her absolute best to escape that cruel fate. She greets the new noble woman warmly, asking if her visit had been too unexpected, but Maria promptly says no. She was very happy to have her there. In fact, she had been wanting to invite the girl for tea ever since the last time they had run into each other, and finally, she calls her inside. They were going to enjoy afternoon tea in the garden. With the two of them already seated, Bianca confesses she had been a little hesitant about coming because she didn't want to interfere in any way. Maria didn't quite know what the woman was referring to, but she took the envelope the main character had carefully prepared. She explains that when she heard about her sick mother the other day, she couldn't just sit at home and do nothing, so she had gone there in person to deliver that. Inviting the girl to read the contents and wishing her to accept the gift with an open heart, without feeling guilty or sad, Maria couldn't believe what she was reading on those lines. It was an official recommendation letter for her mother's hospitalization, but there was a crucial detail. It was for the renowned hospital of St. Lumenia. Bianca explains it was a hospital directly affiliated with the monastery that the Crawford family financially supported. The Wensbury house had certainly looked at hospitals just as good, but when it came to treating tuberculosis, Dr. Kenwell of St. Lumenia was widely recognized as the best in the field. However, the girl questioned the proposal, since she had recently found out they weren't accepting any new patients. But the main character explained that was exactly why she wrote the recommendation letter with her family's seal, in the hope that Dr. Kenwell would be the lead physician for Maria's mother. The girl's eyes were completely filled with tears as she thanked Bianca for such kindness. And our girl politely says she doesn't need to thank her for anything. She was genuinely happy to be able to help. But this wasn't just a simple favor for Maria. To her, Bianca was like her true savior. Her reaction of gratitude leaves our girl somewhat relieved inside. After all, unless she was a completely heartless creature, she doubted Maria would try to kill the person who saved her mother just because she was blind with love later on. The two of them were suddenly interrupted by the Marquis and Marchioness Wensbury, who greet Bianca saying they had no idea she was going to visit them that day. That was an uncomfortable surprise for her, and Maria seemed visibly terrified at their arrival. She stands up apologizing for the sudden visit, but the older ones say that wasn't a problem at all. In fact, The Marchioness was happy to see that pretty face after such a long time, commenting that she had gotten even more beautiful since the last ball before asking about her parents, to which Bianca responds they were doing very well. The woman makes a point of saying that every time she saw a girl as sweet as the main character, she bitterly regretted only having one child. And even though the comments sounded sweet, Bianca knew it wasn't genuine at all. Our girl couldn't help noticing the sad, crumpled expression on Maria's face. She was right behind her. So was the woman trying to make her feel out of place on purpose? Not that the main character didn't perfectly understand the Marchioness's wounded feelings. Maria might be her adoptive daughter now, but she was still the illegitimate child of an affair her husband had had years ago in the countryside. Even so, that was no good justification for the Marchioness to display such disgusting and excluding behavior toward the poor girl. Of course, Bianca wasn't exactly someone who could judge anyone else's conduct, but it was her husband who had personally chosen to take the child in. The older noble woman takes Bianca's hands with forced warmth, and the Marchioness changes her mind about the direction of the afternoon, saying Reinhard would be home soon, and since Bianca had come all this way, it would be wonderful for the two of them to spend a little time together, but Bianca had absolutely no idea what that meant in the woman's head. Why on earth did she have to meet with Reinhard? She had zero interest in him. She didn't even get to formally reply, because the woman had already decreed that instead of wasting time out in the yard, she could come in for tea with her inside the palace. It was getting too hot to be in that sun, asking what the girl was doing in the garden in the first place, acting as if Maria wasn't right there. But Bianca had a very clear objective in mind for that alliance, so she says firmly that she appreciated the invitation, and made it clear she was in the middle of tea with Lady Maria, and the explicit mention of her name made the red-headed girl's eyes go wide in shock, making the Marchioness comment with disdain that it was a true shame, saying mockingly that Maria must have a great talent for storytelling to hold her attention like that, a comment the girl timidly confirms, saying she really enjoyed talking with her. Finally, the Marquess intervened in the mess his wife was causing. Tapping the tip of his cane on the ground, he asks why his wife doesn't just go inside on her own, because he himself wanted to enjoy a bit of sun before going back to his tasks. The woman turns away completely bitter and irritated, sarcastically wishing that he and his dear daughter have a wonderful conversation. The atmosphere in the garden was clearly tense after the Marchioness left, much worse than Bianca had anticipated in her plans, actually. She couldn't even imagine the hell it must be like when she wasn't there to mediate. She even genuinely felt bad for Maria for a moment. Nobody deserved to go through something so humiliating at home. But the moment of tension passed when the Marquess sat down at the table with the two of them and commented that now, with Bianca's valuable help for the young woman, he had one less thing to worry about in his routine. After all, being a rugged man, he wasn't very familiar with the subtle rules of high society. He had even hired a private tutor to help his daughter, but some things girls only truly learn when they're around other women. And Bianca makes a point of praising the girl in front of her father, saying that wasn't a problem at all. She had even exceeded her initial expectations. The man laughed sincerely at the comment, saying that with so much early praise, Maria was going to end up getting very lazy with her studies. And the girl responds nervously and flushed that she was doing her best in every lesson. The main character watched everything in silence. Did the two of them at least have a decent father-daughter relationship in their daily life? She seemed visibly less tense without the stepmother around, shifting the focus of the conversation a bit. Mr. Wensbury comments it was already time for Maria to attend one of the official debutante balls, and she would have to prepare a lot from now on. But that leaves the red-headed girl sad and insecure. She was just a common commoner a few days ago, so maybe it was too early to debut at court. But he was not going to tolerate that negative or insecure attitude from his daughter. After all, how could she expect to enter high society so late while feeding that kind of defeatist thinking? That was, without a doubt, the perfect opportunity for Bianca to get involved. She could directly help the girl with that problem, the much-anticipated debutante ball. It was a gala event where all noble girls were officially introduced to society, a crucial occasion for them to meet potential influential suitors. Normally their mothers accompanied them closely every step of the way, but that was completely impossible for Maria under the current circumstances. Judging by the cruel way the Marchioness of Wensbury treated her behind the scenes, it would certainly be 1,000 times worse if she accompanied her in the ballroom. So Bianca asked if they were talking about the seasonal debutante ball and grabbed the golden opportunity with both hands, offering her help to that lost little girl who had no idea what she was getting herself into.